Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from a rainy morning in Santa Fe. I just got the news that the Ukrainians have managed to blow up part of the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is by far the most significant development of the war to date. And I realize there's been a lot going on in Kiev and Kharkiv and Kherson and everything. All of that's important, but this is the potential game changer that the Ukrainians have been hoping for. The Kerch Bridge is the only large-scale rail connection between mainland Russia and the Crimean Peninsula, which is home to about 2.5 million people, most of whom consider themselves to be Russian citizens, and the bulk of Russian forces both in Crimea and in southwestern Ukraine. There are other rail connections in the Donbass, in Luhansk and Donetsk, but they do not really connect through to the southwest. The rail connections that are relevant go all the way up to the Dnieper. So in order to get rail from the eastern stretches of Ukraine to the southern, they have to basically go right by Russian positions, and those have been within range of artillery since the beginning of the war. You can guarantee that the Ukrainians are going to be targeting those extra closely now. Logistically, it is difficult to understate the criticality of this for the Russians. Russia doesn't have a road network. The money generated per acre of farmland is so low because it's all short season wheat that they've never built one. They've never been able to afford it. So if you want to move things at volume, you have to move them by rail. And with Kerch being the only real connection, it is the primary way that the Russians supply Crimea and the southwestern front with not just troops and equipment, but with food and fuel. And that's for the civilian population as well. That is now all in question. Now, the Ukrainians have been wanting to hit this bridge since the beginning, but they have not been able to prove to the Americans that they can get trained up or be trusted with the long-range rocket systems that would be necessary to target something that's so reinforced and so distant. So they went old school and used a truck bomb. At the moment, damage assessments are still being done, but it is obvious that one of the two major road spans has been dropped. That is not the sort of thing you fix without several months of work. And they timed the explosion to blow up a fuel train that was going through, so the whole thing's on fire. And simply the repair from that is going to be a minimum of a week, assuming it can be repaired at all. Excuse me. And now that the Ukrainians know it can be done, you can bet they're going to try to hit other parts of it to make sure the thing stays offline. Now, for the first time, we have a path forward for the Ukrainians here to win that is not long and windy. I've always been cautious about saying that Ukraine can win this because by the numbers they can't, especially with the mobilization and the Russians planning on throwing at least 500,000 troops into it. I mean, you throw 500,000 troops into anything, no matter how badly supplied they are, and you can move the boulder and make the situation very different. And that is how Russia has traditionally won all of its wars. But you don't throw 500,000 people at logistics. This is something where either you have the connections or you don't. And if we're talking about Russian troops in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson and Crimea suddenly being on their own, the Russians can only supply those three regions in two ways now. One is by truck. And we know that because of all the javelins that have been put into Ukraine and all the RPGs, that the Russians are almost out of their entire military tactical truck fleet, and they've started using city buses and Scooby-Doo vans. And those just can't take the volume of stuff that an active front line needs, and they're certainly far more vulnerable to disruption. The second option is ships. You do have major ports at Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, but if we're now in a situation where Kerch can't supply things like anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles, food, it's very easy to see the Ukrainians being able to repeat the feat that they did earlier this summer when they sunk the flagship, the Moskva, and do that to every single cargo ship that the Russians try to bring in. Losing cargo ships in that volume, losing trucks and buses in that volume, is hollowing out the entirety of the Russian internal transport system. This is the sort of thing that if you bleed this fast, it takes a decade to recover from. And in a war zone, that is not going to happen, particularly since we're in an environment of sanctions where people are getting more and more skittish about selling the Russians anything. So for the first time, the Ukrainians have a window to victory, and that's my sign that I'm done. Okay, you all take care. I'll give you an update as soon as I have more information. Hey everyone, hello from the woods of Georgia. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the drones that the Russians have started using in the Ukraine war, specifically the ones that are imported from Iran. Now, there's three big takeaways here. Number one, we're now getting a front row seat to find out just how collapsed the entire industrial base in the Russian system is. You know, this at one point was the second most powerful manufacturing power in the world at the height of the Soviet Empire in the 1960s. And now they are reliant upon what are basically flying mopeds from a country that has been under sanctions for 30 years and is a technological leader in nothing. It would be very easy in the West for us to retrofit a third-grade auto facility to produce things like this, and the Russians clearly cannot do it themselves, not at scale individually. And when you look at some of their advanced weapon systems that we've all been hearing about for years that at least on paper look really good, the Russians have had to hand make some of the new fighter bombers to the tune of one a year because that's all they can manage. So getting dozens and maybe even hundreds of drones from the Iranians all of a sudden is one of their more viable options for resupply. And that's honestly, that's kind of embarrassing. Second, the problems have a problem with leverage. Now, in the ongoing American-Iranian saga, I mean, the two sides don't get along, they haven't for a long time, but the Iranians have always kind of reserved the right to bring the Russians into the mix in order to disrupt things. And the Russians have always stuck their nose into relations between the Americans and the Iranians whenever it looks like the two of them might actually get along for a change in order to keep that alive. All of a sudden, it's Iran that has all the leverage because, yes, the Iranians are providing weapons to Iran, to a country that honestly should not have a problem making these themselves. But the question is, how do you compensate the Russians for them? And the best guess from what we've seen so far is the Russians have promised to launch a satellite for Iran, which, you know, these drones go for about 20 grand a pop. So paying for a few dozen to a few hundred drones with a satellite launch to give Iran a fundamentally new capacity, wow, that is not an equitable trade, but it's really all the Russians have on offer. I mean, what else are the Russians going to send Iran? Oil? Please. Third and finally, there's the question of war crimes. Now, the Iranian weapons are not very sophisticated. They can't pick their own targets. They can't dodge. You basically program in some coordinates and they take off. They fly at a relatively stable altitude and they basically go in a straight line from the point of launch to the point of detonation, which means that every single thing that the Russians hit was either something they were aiming for specifically or something that just happened to get in the way because it was too tall. So usually the former rather than the latter. And because these things move so slowly, only about 60 to 100 miles an hour, and because they're so loud, then they can be downed by a small arms fire, the Russians have been launching them in groups of at least 6, sometimes it's up to 20, just to make sure that at least one of them gets to the end location. Look at the targets that the Russians have been choosing. Glass bridges, power plants, apartment blocks, things that are absolutely 100% not military targets. That tells us two things. Number one, they're not just deliberately committing war crimes, they're programming those same coordinates in 5, 10, 20 times to make sure they hit the target, which is about as deliberate as war crimes can get. Second, there are almost no reports of the Russians targeting military targets. Now, military targets evolve, and so in order to hit a building that has what you want, you need some intelligence. That's probably why the Russians aren't going after them, because they have none. Their satellite reconnaissance is not working, or at least it's not being communicated to the people who are launching these assaults. They don't have fighter or reconnaissance plane cover at all. And their drones aren't good enough with optics and range to provide them with the basic information they need for military targeting. So all that's left is civilian targeting. Now, for the Ukrainians, this is the best and the worst of all worlds. The worst is obvious. What's vulnerable are buildings that are of civilian make that, you know, can't move, and they're the same thing every day. On the good side, it does mean that any logistical depots that the Ukrainians have are, I don't want to say immune to Russian assaults, but heavily resistant because the Russians are demonstrating they don't have sufficient battlefield logistical intelligence to even provide some base targeting profiles. That would seem to suggest that at least for the remainder of this year and maybe into the first quarter of next year, that Ukraine absolutely has flipped the balance of forces when it comes to deep strike options, despite the fact that it still doesn't have nearly as much heavy equipment or aircraft as the Russians have. The Russians are just unable to leverage what they have, assuming it works at all. For the Ukrainians, this is the best and worst of all worlds. The worst is obvious. Ukrainian buildings don't move, civilian assets don't move, they don't change day to day, so that's what the Russians are capable of targeting, that's what they're going after. On the best, military equipment does move. What logistical depot or arms depot is important one day is not necessarily important the next, and that requires actual intelligence to provide the targeting coordinates that the other side needs in order to mess up your military operations. It is clear that the Russians lack the capacity to do that. So even though the Russians still have a lot more men and equipment, with certainly a lot more men on the way, at least for the next few months, the Ukrainians actually have better deep strike capacity because they have eyes on the ground, either directly through their human operations or indirectly through the Americans. And when it comes down to making sure that every shot counts, that's what you need. All right, that's it from me. Until next time.